Let me tell you something that doesn't quite make the front pages of American media the way it probably should. Canada, the country that spent years telling the world it was open, welcoming, and the moral alternative to America's immigration chaos, quietly pulled off one of the most dramatic immigration reversals of any developed nation in recent memory. And the reaction has been explosive. People are furious. But here's the thing. It's not just one group that's angry. It's everyone, almost simultaneously, for completely different reasons. And that tension right there is exactly why this story matters. So let's start at the beginning, because understanding where Canada is today requires understanding what Canada promised just a few years ago. Post-pandemic, Canada made a conscious, loud, very deliberate decision to open its doors wide. The Trudeau government had a plan, bring in massive numbers of workers, international students, and temporary residents to fuel a recovering economy. By 2024, Canada was targeting 500,000 new permanent residents in a single year. That number is almost hard to process when you consider Canada's total population is around 41 million people. We're talking about adding the equivalent of a mid-sized city's worth of new permanent residents every 12 months, on top of a massive wave of temporary residents that was simultaneously flooding in. At the peak, temporary residents, international students, foreign workers, and others made up about 7.25% of Canada's entire population. That's not a footnote. That is a structural shift. And the system was being gamed. Trudeau himself admitted it on camera. Colleges and universities, particularly smaller ones, had discovered that international students were an almost limitless revenue stream. Tuition fees for international students are often 4 or 5 times higher than for domestic students. So institutions started recruiting aggressively, not necessarily because they had the capacity to educate that many students, but because they needed the revenue. Private colleges that had almost no academic reputation were suddenly processing thousands of international student applications, and the students themselves, mostly from India, the Philippines, Nigeria, and other countries, were not just coming to study. They were coming because Canada's immigration pathway was explicitly marketed as a route to permanent residency. The government was saying, come study, work here after graduation, and you can build a life in Canada. That was the promise. Hundreds of thousands of people reorganized their entire lives around that promise. Then came the housing crisis. Then came inflation. Then came the political pressure. And suddenly the math didn't add up anymore. Canada's housing market was already stretched dangerously thin. Rental prices in cities like Toronto and Vancouver had been climbing for years. But the speed of population growth, not just from immigration, but from domestic trends too, was making the affordability crisis acute and visible. Public polling began to shift. Canadians who had consistently shown pro-immigration attitudes started to crack. By late 2024, surveys were showing that a growing share of the Canadian population believed the country had taken in more immigrants than it could handle. That is a remarkable shift in a country that had basically built its modern identity around being open to the world. So what did the government do? It pivoted, hard and fast. In October 2024, then Immigration Minister Mark Miller announced the 2025 to 2027 immigration levels plan. The numbers were dramatic. Permanent resident targets were cut from 500,000 down to 395,000 for 2025, then further down to 380,000 in 2026 and 365,000 in 2027. And that is a 21% decrease. On the temporary side, study permit caps were introduced and then tightened. International student arrivals were deliberately squeezed. New language requirements were added for post-graduation work permits. Spousal open work permits were restricted. And the government set an explicit target to reduce temporary residents from 7.25% of the population all the way down to 5% by 2027. Miller put it plainly, the era of uncapped programs to come into this country is quickly coming to an end. Trudeau, for his part, acknowledged on video that the government could have moved faster to adjust when the post-pandemic demand for labor cooled off. Looking back, when the post-pandemic boom cooled and businesses no longer needed the additional labor, we could have acted quicker to adjust, he said. It was a rare public acknowledgement that the policy had gone sideways, and it landed like a gut punch for the hundreds of thousands of people who had already arrived and built their lives around the old rules. Here is where the furious part really kicks in, because what happened next was not a managed transition. It was a cliff. International student arrivals collapsed. By October 2025, Canada had seen a nearly 60% drop in international student arrivals compared to the year before. The visa rejection rate shot up to 62%, the highest it had been in an entire decade. For Indian applicants specifically, it reached as high as 80% refusal. And for students already inside Canada on post-graduation work permits, the picture was even more dire. Between 70,000 and 130,000 post-graduation work permit holders saw their visas expiring in 2024 and 2025. Most did not receive extensions. Most did not get invited to apply for permanent residency, the very thing they had been promised when they arrived. Some stayed anyway on expired permits, joining what economists estimate could be close to 1 million undocumented residents in Canada. Many others left deeply in debt, having spent years paying international tuition fees that had essentially funded an institutional Ponzi scheme. The colleges that had feasted on this system are now paying the price too. Sheridan College, considered one of the top animation schools in the world, suspended 40 programs and laid off staff. Universities across the country announced hiring freezes. Institutions that had built their entire financial model around international student revenue were suddenly facing catastrophic budget shortfalls. A Canadian Auditor General report found that the government had vastly underestimated the impact of its own policies. New international study visas issued by Canada dropped from 456,690 in 2023 to just 50,370 by September 2025. That is not a policy adjustment. That is a near total collapse of an industry in under 2 years. And then there is the political dimension. When Mark Carney replaced Trudeau as Prime Minister following the 2025 federal election, a Liberal win that surprised many, he did not reverse course. He doubled down. Carney had campaigned on the idea that the previous wave of immigration had outpaced Canada's capacity, and he was explicit about it. He said Canada had welcomed far more foreign workers, students, and newcomers than it had housing for, healthcare for, or social services for. His government committed to capping temporary residents at 5% of the population by 2027 and bringing permanent resident targets below 1% of the total population annually. He framed it as getting immigration under control, language that would have seemed almost unthinkable from a Canadian Liberal Prime Minister just 5 years ago. The provinces pushed back, but not all in the same direction. Some provincial ministers and business groups argued the cuts were short-sighted and would undermine economic recovery. They pointed to critical labor shortages in agriculture, healthcare, and construction. Others quietly welcomed the slowdown, and immigrant advocacy groups used far stronger language. Syed Hussain of the Migrant Rights Network called the changes one of the most egregious rollbacks of migrant rights in Canadian history. Protests erupted in Brampton, Ontario, where students in post-graduation work permit holders demonstrated against deportations and demanded pathways to permanent residency for people who had already invested years of their lives in Canada. Now, here's my read on what actually happened here, and why I think it is a story with much wider implications. Canada's immigration system between 2020 and 2024 was operating on a faulty assumption that you could dramatically scale up population through immigration without simultaneously scaling up the infrastructure that population needs to live. Housing, transit, healthcare, social services, educational capacity. None of these things scale overnight. The government essentially opened the taps to full blast without building more pipes. And when the pressure became politically unbearable, it closed the taps almost completely, leaving hundreds of thousands of people stranded mid-process. What makes this particularly hard to untangle is that the anger is coming from multiple directions at once, and almost none of it is simple. Longtime Canadians frustrated about housing costs are angry. International students who were explicitly recruited and promised a pathway are angry and feel betrayed. Colleges and universities facing financial ruin are angry. Provinces that relied on immigration to fill healthcare and labor gaps are angry. And immigrant advocacy groups watching people get deported after years of legal residence are furious. Everyone has a legitimate grievance, and they are all, in a sense, the product of the same policy failure, a system that overpromised, underbuilt, and then overcorrected. From a macroeconomic standpoint, Canada is walking a genuinely difficult tightrope. On one side, you have a rapidly aging domestic population that needs immigrants to sustain its labor force and tax base. On the other, you have a housing supply that has been broken for decades and a public that is tapping out on its patience. The Carney government is betting that a hard reset, lower numbers, stricter selection, focus on integration, will stabilize things before the demographic bill comes due. Whether that bet pays off, based on what we're seeing so far, is genuinely uncertain. What I keep coming back to is the human cost. People who did everything right, who followed the rules, paid the tuition, worked the jobs, paid the taxes, are now being told the rules changed. That is not a small thing. That corrodes trust. It corrodes Canada's global reputation as a destination for ambitious, hardworking people. And once that reputation takes a serious hit, rebuilding it is not something that happens in a budget cycle or an election cycle. It takes a generation. So here is the question I want to leave you with. When a country that built its modern identity on being open to the world decides it went too far too fast, What does that say about the limits of immigration as a standalone economic policy? And what does it mean for every other country currently trying to thread that same needle?